This presentation was prepared by Brandon Howard and Sarah Tanase on the neurobiology of bias based on sexual orientation. Documentation of sexual orientation dates to ancient Greece around 2900 BCE. The Greeks did not have terms or concepts that referred to the sexual identity of people such as heterosexual or homosexual. They only had words for people doing homosexual or heterosexual acts. They left behind plenty of literature that suggests that it was permissible for people to respond erotically to either sex. However, reproduction was often expected to bolster the army and population. In contrast, many other civilizations were not as tolerant, such as the Roman Republic, which ordered executions for homosexual acts in 529 AD due to social and economic turmoil in addition to the Catholic influence of the time, which began to heavily focus on natural law. The latter part of the 12th through 14th centuries showed a sharp rise in intolerance towards homosexual sex, alongside persecution of Jews, Muslims, heretics, and others. This is largely due to the Catholic Church's attempt to appeal to a conception of natural law as the standard of morality, and thus defined it in such a way to forbid homosexual sex, as well as extramarital sex, non-procreative sex within marriage, and even masturbation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, an openly theological framework no longer dominated the dialogue about same-sex attraction. Instead, secular arguments and interpretations became increasingly common, which was not always beneficial. Probably the most important secular domain for discussions of homosexuality was in medicine and psychology. This pathological discourse was heavily influenced by considerations about the state and its need for a growing population, good soldiers, and intact families marked by clear defined gender roles. In 1864, Karl Ulrich developed his third sex theory, which states that gays and lesbians have the other gender's soul trapped in their body. He is considered to be one of the first main advocates for homosexual rights and tried to have it decriminalized. In 1868, the word homosexuality was first used by Carl Maria Benkert, who intended for it to help as a legal and scientific term, which could be used to protect homosexuals as minorities. Around the beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. and others began to classify it as a learned personality disorder that was criminalized. In the mid-1930s, the practice of conversion therapy was suggested by renowned psychologist Sigmund Freud and became popular using extreme techniques such as chemical and electroshock aversion therapy. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association classified homosexuality as a mental illness that needed to be cured. In the 20th century, sexual roles were redefined once again for a variety of reasons, with premarital intercourse slowly becoming more common and eventually acceptable. With the decline of prohibitions against sex for the sake of pleasure, even outside of marriage, it became more difficult to argue against gay sex. These trends were especially strong in the 1960s, and it was in this context that the gay liberation movement took off. In the culmination of increased tension, on June 28, 1969, the Stonewall Rebellion in New York City began a new era of the gay rights movement that is present today. Due to increasing pressures and new evidence, the American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder in 1973, but added a new disorder categorized by homosexual feelings with strong desires to change, which was later declassified in 1987. In 1983, gays and lesbians could now serve in the U.S. military, but only under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. In 1986, the Roman Catholic Church called homosexuality an objective disorder, which intensified the religious opposition to LGBT rights. On December 21, 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act was signed into law by President Bill Clinton, which restricted federal marriage rights and benefits to heterosexual couples only. Throughout the early 21st century, several highly controversial papers suggested that homosexuality is caused in childhood and that it is possible to convert. On December 18, 2010, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. Two particularly promising suspects for the change in public opinion about homosexuality are the shifts in mass information about homosexuality and awareness of gays and lesbians. In the 2013 Supreme Court case, United States v. Windsor, Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act was declared unconstitutional, which allowed for federal recognition of gay marriages in states where it is currently legal. On June 26, 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that gay marriage is a constitutional right, meaning that all 50 states must allow it and that all existing bans are invalid. The decision concluded a decades-long battle over whether gay marriage should be legalized. Title VII, or the American Civil Rights Act, which offers equal employment protection, still does not explicitly state that it protects the LGBT community. But as of April 4, 2017, the Ninth Circuit Court of the U.S. ruled that it is unconstitutional to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. However, some violations continue to go unsettled today. Finally, in recent history, President Trump has issued an executive order on March 27, 2017, reversing many of the benefits from former President Barack Obama's previous executive order, which protected LGBT persons working in the federal government.
Perhaps one of the most influential court cases involving sexual orientation discrimination is Kimberly Hadley v. Ivy Tech Community College of Indiana, which took place April 4, 2017 in Chicago. Kimberly Hively was a part-time professor who claimed she was denied a full-time position because she is lesbian. She had applied to multiple other jobs at the college and had not been offered any, for which she believed to be due to their bias against her sexual orientation. After extensive research into her claims, the chief judge ruled in favor of Hively, claiming that it is actually impossible to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation without discriminating on the basis of sex. This was the first time that Title VII protections extended to sexual orientation discrimination in the Seventh Circuit. Although Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not explicitly include sexual orientation or gender identity, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in courts determined that sex discrimination encompasses prejudices against these two. Sexual orientation bias is not only present in the adult workplace, but also in education amongst youth. Jesse Montgomery was a homosexual student in the independent school district. Throughout 11 years of his education, kindergarten to 10th grade, he was verbally, physically, and sexually harassed by his other classmates. It began with normal teasing and some stereotype name-calling, then escalated to verbal and physical assault, and then sexual harassment. Students would beat, trip, and grab Jesse in inappropriate places, and some even pretended to have sexual intercourse with him as another sat by and laughed. The court ruled in favor of Montgomery, involving protections under Title IX, which encompasses sex discrimination in education. Sexual orientation discrimination is no small issue, and sometimes the court is the problem instead of solving it. The Black family consists of a mother, father, and 3 children, all of whom were strongly religious. The mother, Rochelle Black, realized that she was homosexual and told her husband, but due to their strong family values, they continued to live together for the good of the children. Rochelle was a stay-at-home parent and the primary caregiver for the children, while the father worked to provide financial support for the family. Rochelle filed a divorce after realizing her sexual preferences, and on March 8, 2016 in Washington, the Blacks went to court. The court ruled that despite the mother's large role in the children's lives, the father would have primary custody in the divorce. Additionally, they limited the mother's ability to speak of her sexual orientation to her children or introduce her long-term partner to her kids. This ruling could have been due to the judge's prejudice against homosexuality or possibly due to religious beliefs. This leads to the 4 commonly theorized functions potentially driving the stigma and negative feelings towards individuals based on sexual orientation. The first is value expressive, meaning that the person is biased against sexual minorities because it aligns with their religious or moral beliefs. The second is social expressive, when sexual prejudice is demonstrated to conform to the norms of their social group. Next is experiential, which stems from a lack of exposure to the population or a past negative experience with someone of that sexual orientation. The last is defensive, when the individual feels threatened by people of a certain sexual orientation due to the fear or uncertainty about their own sexual preferences. This is the function that typically sets sexual orientation bias apart from other types of discrimination. A study was done by Mahaffey, Bryan, Ito, and Hutchinson testing the defensive function of anti-gay prejudice. They utilized the startle eye blink reflex to detect positive and negative affect towards an individual. The eye blink magnitude is facilitated or increased in a negative affective state and inhibited or decreased in a positive affective state. In this study, they pre-selected male participants who were chosen based on their scores on an explicit measure of anti-gay bias to span low, moderate, and high bias. They received the startle probe at 2 different lead times, allowing for the indexing of effective response that occur more quickly, the shorter lead time, and after more time is allowed for cognitive processing, the longer lead time. They hypothesized that if the defensive function is truly associated with internal conflict regarding sexuality, then the initial affect when viewing a same-sex couple would be more positive as reflected in the short lead interval, and become less positive after additional cognitive processing as reflected in the long lead interval. They also hypothesized that there would be consistency between self-reported and physiological responses for low and moderate bias men, but there would be inconsistency between self-reported and physiological responses for high bias men. It is also important to note that the defensive function is only thought to be present in men with high anti-gay bias, so these results should only be seen in men with high levels of explicit bias against homosexual males. The results show no significant effective lead time, but as predicted, the startle eye blink response towards gay male stimuli varied between the 2 lead times depending on the level of pre-existing attitude. Looking at the bar graph, we can see that the significant effective lead time was present only in the high anti-gay bias group, but not the low and moderate groups. This suggests that the defensive function is a possibility and that for some highly biased individuals, their aggression towards sexual minorities could be due to denial, confusion, or suppression of their own sexual orientation and identity. Another study performed by Adams, Wright, and Lord delved deeper into the possibility of the defensive function. In this experiment, heterosexual and homosexual male subjects were shown sexually explicit material involving a heterosexual couple, a gay couple, and a lesbian couple. Then their sexual arousal in response to the tapes was recorded. In the figure, the graphs show the stimulus presentations by group, the top graph being the heterosexual video, the middle being the lesbian video, and the bottom being the gay video. The dotted line represents the response of the non-homophobic group, while the solid line represents the responses of the homophobic group. The only significantly different responses to these videotapes are in regards to the male-male video. The homophobic group exhibited a higher sexual arousal than the non-homophobic group when watching the gay sexual interaction. However, for the heterosexual and lesbian videotapes, there is no significant difference between the two groups. These findings support the fact that some prejudice against homosexual individuals may be due to the defensive function. Shields and Harriman also observed physiological responses when viewing homosexual couples, but they measured heart rate instead. They wanted to test the validity of the term homophobia by seeing whether or not homonegative males, or males with high negative attitudes towards male homosexuality, actually do exhibit fear rather than just dislike in response to homosexual males. In this study, subjects were shown slides of landscapes and slides depicting explicit sexual activity between two men. If homophobia does exist in all high anti-gay bias males, then we expect to see homonegative males exhibit heart rate acceleration to slides of male-male sexual activity and heart rate deceleration to all other slide types presented during the study. The results of the pilot study showed that high homonegative attitudes were necessary but not sufficient for heart rate acceleration to male-male slides, meaning that the term homophobic applies to some but not all strongly anti-gay biased individuals. In another study by Dichter, Forstel, and Mulder exploring attentional differences to sexual orientations, subjects were shown pictures of homosexual and heterosexual couples in a picture viewing task. This was designed to assess implicit levels of discomfort through EEG, namely the P2 and N1 components, and explicit evaluations of pleasantness through self-report towards the images. They also took note of exposure of the subjects to homosexual individuals before conducting the experiment. The results showed differences in the processing of sexual orientation as early as 200 milliseconds, and a faster dismissal and lower pleasantness rating of pictures of gay couples. They also found a relationship between early neural attention to out-group lesbian versus in-group heterosexual couples and their past exposure to homosexual individuals. This suggests that much of the processing of sexual orientation is due to the degree of exposure they had to that group previously, and can manipulate how quickly you perceive sexual orientation.
Social motivations, such as the desire to associate or compete, are among the most prominent human drives. As a result, we are fundamentally very efficient and wired to easily distinguish us from them in our everyday lives. Although our brain performs these categorizations unconsciously, they lead to social categorization, stereotypes, prejudices, intergroup conflict, inequality, and in extreme situations from history, war and genocide. Although prejudice stems from a mechanism of survival built on cognitive networks that structure and categorize the physical world, its function in our modern society is complex, sometimes ill-adapted, and its effects can often be harmful. In the modern social psychology literature, prejudice is defined as an attitude towards a person on the basis of his or her group membership. The prejudice network is an interactive set of neural structures that underlie the components of a prejudice response. The amygdala is involved in the rapid processing of social category cues, including racial groups, in terms of potential threat or reward. Findings from functional neuroimaging research on economic bargaining and reinforcement learning suggest that striatal activation is associated with the computation of value and that there is increased striatal activity when viewing an in-group versus an out-group. The insula supports instinctual and subjective emotional responses towards social groups similar to oneself, called in-groups, or social groups that differ, called out-groups. Affect-driven judgments of social out-group members rely on the orbitofrontal cortex and may be categorized by reduced activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region involved with the formation of impressions about other people, especially impressions that require considering a person's unique perspectives and motives. The orbitofrontal cortex supports the monitoring of social cues and subsequent adjustment of one's behavior, which is crucial in intergroup situations involving social norms where social responses may be influenced by others' expectations. The regulation network is composed of neural structures that support the regulation and preservation of intergroup responses and biases. Conflicts between a biased tendency and either internal goals or external cues, for example, social norms, are processed in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and rostral anterior cingulate cortex, respectively. The medial prefrontal cortex is involved in seeing other unique perspectives and motives, and activation in this region provides further representation of the interpersonal cues to guide regulatory processing. Intergroup response goals are represented in the lateral prefrontal cortex and implemented and maintained in outward behavior in coordination with the striatum and the motor cortex. Additionally, stereotyping involves cortical structures that support more general forms of semantic memory, object memory, retrieval, and conceptual activation, such as the temporal lobes and inferior frontal gyrus. In summary, we are literally wired to discriminate based on physical characteristics. Politics and law heavily influence acceptance and bias. The more exposure one has to homosexual individuals, the less neural attention is devoted to sexual orientation differences. Defensive function of bias formation is perhaps what sets apart sexual orientation discrimination from other types of discrimination. Although these neural processes were once evolutionarily beneficial, they have since become detrimental social effects in our modern society. There are various ways that we can change. Sexual stigma can be reduced by targeting the underlying processes that lead to sexual orientation prejudice. Pettigrew and Trope showed that heterosexuals who have close relationships with at least one LGBT individual report lower levels of sexual prejudice than those who do not know a single LGBT person. This is likely due to the fact that these positive associations are generalized to all sexual minorities in positive ways. This can help to reverse these learned fears and negative associations that have become ingrained in these individuals. Through personal experience in social institutions, people learn that LGBT individuals are abnormal and that heterosexuals are normal. For example, young boys are consistently reminded that they need to be masculine and anti-feminine to avoid being gay. Young boys tease and intimidate each other over defending their masculinity and reward each other for it. This reinforces the cyclical behavior. Over time, we learn to almost automatically view sexual minorities as wrong and lesser. Changing these harmful social institutions begins by reducing heterosexism at the societal level, in addition to the individual level, to help counter this cycle of sexual prejudice and violence. We can also improve hate crime legislation. We can include LGBT individuals in the specifics of laws such as Title VII. Positive LGBT members can be portrayed in the media and pop culture. Social norm interventions can be used to correct misconceptions of LGBT people, such as preventing the use of phrases such as "that's gay" to represent something negative. Lastly, by preventing sexual discrimination based on religious or cultural beliefs, we can allow for positive exposure of the LGBT community to ignorant individuals to decrease stereotypes and bias due to lack of contact.